Welcome everybody to our conference once again on privatizing public schools. And one of the most important topics we want to talk about tonight is with our guests. We are so excited and so proud to have with us Jane Wettach of the Duke University. She is just filling me in earlier tonight on her retirement last July and all the marvelous things that she's doing right now. And of course, what we are very interested in tonight is her presentation talking to us about school vouchers in North Carolina, what's going on, what should be going on, and maybe some of her thoughts on ways to improve this program in the future. So we're very happy to have her. She is well known over at Duke. She was the former director of the Children's Law Center. She taught education law at Duke Law School. She received her journalism degree in '76 and her JD with honors in 1981. So we're really proud of her. And she got both of these degrees right here in North Carolina at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. One of the things that I've always been very much a follower of Jane's is because of her work in special education, which is something I've always cared a lot about, along with her work in the school to prison pipeline and other things that talk about the educational rights of children. So Jane, you're really someone that many people admire, and you were so admired by so many people statewide that in 2010, the Justice Center, Matt, nominated and awarded Jane the Defenders of Justice Award, which is a fabulous award recognizing the things that people do in their careers to advance the rights of others, and in this case, Jane, children. So we're really happy to have you here. And joining us tonight is Matt Ellingwood. Matt will be our moderator tonight, and he's going to direct the question and answers at the end of the program. Matt joined the North Carolina Justice Center as a policy analyst in the Education and Law Project in August of 2010, about when I met Matt, when he first joined the center, and he directs the Justice Center's legislative advocacy on education policy issues. He's very interested in promoting equity and the impact that the quality of education and how we can make sure that that's given to every child in North Carolina, especially low-income North Carolinians. Matt also got his undergraduate degree in the University of Pennsylvania, and he got an education education policy, I believe, and management from Harvard, Matt, and then he received his law degree from Temple University. So we have two brilliant lawyers here tonight who know a lot about education law. So we should have a great presentation. So I want to thank you both for being here tonight. And Jane, we're going to, wait a minute, I should have, as I was talking, and I apologize, y'all, I'm not, should have advanced that good looking picture of Matt. And now we're going to go ahead and Jane, we're going to go off camera here for a few minutes, and we're going to let you go ahead and present your presentation on school vouchers in North Carolina. Everybody, thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Yvonne. I'm really happy to be here with you and with Matt and with your audience to talk about North Carolina's school voucher program. So my goal tonight is just to give the audience some facts about the program so that you can talk intelligently about it and potentially talk to your legislators about what you think about the program, especially if you have some thoughts after this on how it might be changed. So let's go ahead and advance to the next slide, Yvonne. All right, so just getting started, what is the school voucher program? Well, the school voucher program, which is also known as the Opportunity Scholarship Program, is a program that was created by the North Carolina General Assembly in 2013 and first funded and in operation in 2014. And what it does at its core, it provides an annual voucher or payment of up to $4,200 to pay for private school tuition for school-aged children. So that's basically what the voucher is. Some people call it a scholarship. It's a payment, however, to be applied to private school tuition for a North Carolina child. Before we go on, I do want to mention that there are 2 other voucher programs in North Carolina. And one of them is called the Disabilities Grant, and that provides up to $8,000 to students with disabilities who enroll in private schools, can cover tuition and fees and some other qualified expenses. We also have something called the Education Savings Account, which can provide up to $9,000 in support for a child with disabilities who is attending a private school, and it can cover a variety of costs related to the education of students with disabilities. I am not going to be talking about either of those 2 programs tonight, but I did want you to know, because you might hear about them, that there are these 3 voucher programs. The main one, however, is the Opportunity Scholarship Program, which I'm just going to call the voucher program tonight. And that's the one that I am talking about. So the voucher program is administered at the state level. It is a statewide program. It's administered by the what the acronym is the SEAA, the State Education Assistance Authority. Some of you may have come across that. They also handle matters related to student loans at the college level. But it was given the authority to administer this program. So when I refer to data that the state publishes, that's the agency that publishes it. The State Education Assistance Authority. So if you want to follow up on anything I've said tonight, go to their website. They do have a link for data and a lot of information about the program. All right, so that's basically the background. So let's start by looking at the money, because that's, of course, one of the most important things about this program is it's costing the taxpayers money. To date, we have spent in North Carolina a little over $220 million on the program since it started in 2014. We're at about $63 million a year now, and you can see in that graph that the amount of spending has been going up every year. Interestingly, the legislature has authorized or appropriated much more money than has been spent. So the program has been, one might say, underutilized in one sense, in that there is more money there and more vouchers that could be issued. There are ways that the legislature is expanding the program to take advantage of that appropriation. And so this graph could be more severe in terms of its increase over the next several years as the legislature, if the legislature continues to loosen eligibility requirements so that more people can participate. All right, let's move to the next slide. So this is about the numbers. So we've got right now in the program, we've got about 16,000 students who are getting a voucher in this current school year. You can see, as well as on the previous slide, there's been increased participation in every single year since it started. One thing, just as a reference, I said there are 16,000 recipients. There are 1.5 million school children in North Carolina. So it's still a fairly small number of children compared to all the children in North Carolina who participate. One of the reasons for this is there has been a limit on the amount of money that could be spent on kindergartners and first graders who were starting school and had not ever gone to public school. And the program otherwise, as we'll get to a little bit, requires students to have gone to public school before they get a voucher. but kindergartners and first graders don't have to do that. Nevertheless, the program was capped so that no more than 40% of the voucher money that's available could be spent on those kindergartners and first graders. That limit has been lifted. So we may see an even greater increase, as I said, next year. That was the only category in which there was ever a waiting list. So until now, anybody who was in second grade or higher and had been enrolled in public school the year before could apply for a voucher, and there were enough vouchers. Because of that 40% cap, there has in some years been a waiting list for kindergartners and first graders. And so not everybody in those categories who applied got a voucher. I am expecting that now that that cap is lifted, there won't be a waiting list for anyone, and that any student who applies and is otherwise eligible will be able to get a voucher if they want one. All right, so let's move on and look at the eligibility rules. So who can get a voucher in North Carolina? So this has been described sometimes as a way for lower income families to have the same choice to go to private school that wealthier families do. So there are financial eligibility limits, which means you have to be under the limit. I'm going to show you that on the next slide. So first is financial eligibility, and we'll look at the details of that in just a second. The second one is that the students have to meet one of the criteria that is on that list. And the most common one is that the student must have attended a public school or a Department of Defense school in the spring semester prior to the school year in which they're applying for a voucher. There are a few small exceptions to that, such as I mentioned, you're entering kindergarten or first grade, adoption, foster care, and then the one that affects probably the most, the highest number of other children would be parents on the full-time military duty don't have to have gone to a public school the year before. Now that requirement to have gone to the public school the year before is just in your first year of application, because renewals are automatically eligible as long as their family has continued to maintain the financial eligibility. So in other words, once you get a voucher, you're in the top priority category to get another voucher for the following year, so long as your family remains financially within the limits. There are some, you have to be 5 years old, you have to live in North Carolina, you can't have earned a high school degree, so those don't really affect all that many students. All right, let's move on to the next one, and yes, financial eligibility. So the financial eligibility, you can see here, and those numbers may be really small for you, so I'll read some of them, but you can see the large one. A family of 4 who has an income of less than $73,500 is eligible for a voucher. Now, a couple of things. These financial eligibility guidelines are pegged to eligibility for the school lunch program, the federal school lunch program. And you can see there are 3 columns in the chart. The left column is the course number in the household, but then there are 2 dollar limits. And one of them is for 100% of the federal school lunch program, and the other is relates to 150% of the federal school lunch program. So the reason for that is if a family has an income that is less than 100% of the federal school lunch eligibility, they're eligible for a full voucher of $4,200 per child per year. If the income is between 100% and 150%, then there could be a reduction in the amount of the voucher, which depends on how much the tuition at the school is. The limit is that if you're in that higher category between 100 and 150%, you're only eligible for 90% of the tuition at the school, or $4,200, whichever is less. So, excuse me a minute, let me look at my notes because I did the math on that. So if the tuition is more than $4,700, then even a family whose income is up to 150% of the federal lunch program standards is eligible for the full $4,200 voucher payment. If the tuition is less than $4,200, then that family only gets 90% of the tuition. So those are the two categories, but most people who get a voucher are eligible for the whole $4,200. Although interestingly, the average voucher as of last year was a little less than $4,000. So there can be a variety of reasons why that is. Part of it is this reduction here. Part of it is the amount of the tuition that is charged. There may be some other reasons that I don't quite understand, but the average voucher was less than the highest potential voucher of $4,200. All right, let's move on and look at a little bit about who is getting vouchers. So as I said, there are about 16,000 current voucher recipients. On the left-hand side, the pie chart is showing you how many have selected a religious school and how many have selected a secular school. 92% of the students have selected religious schools. This is not this year, that's last year's data. It's probably about the same. It's been about the same for most of the program's history since the beginning. The very large percentage, ranging in the 90% range, have been families who have chosen to use a voucher to attend a religious school. You can see in this, so just 8% are in secular schools. And that may vary a little bit, but it has been highly more popular for students selecting religious schools. And there can be a variety of reasons for that. One is a lot of the secular schools tend to have slightly higher tuitions because they are subsidized by the churches. And families have to make up the difference of the tuition. If the tuition is more than the $4,200, they can take their voucher, pay the $4,200, but then they have to pay the rest. So if the tuition's $5,000, they have to pay $800. If it's $7,000, they have to pay $2,800. So many of them may not be able to afford going to a private school, even if they have a voucher. But the religious schools do tend to have lower tuitions because of that subsidy by the churches. And there may be other reasons why religious schools have less tuition. Sometimes the building is owned by the church and the school gets it for limited rent, so they can keep the tuition down that way. As we'll talk about a little later, they don't have to hire certified teachers, so they can keep their salaries down. There are a number of reasons why religious schools have lower tuitions. And then the pie chart on the right is showing you how many at each level of schooling. The 65% there is the number of elementary school students. Then, oh, I'm sorry, that label I see now is not so good. And I think it's about 24% or something like that is in middle school, and then 13% at the high school level. I don't really have any data on why the high school level is that much limited. Partly it's because students, younger students have been applying more, and since the program is young, didn't start till 2014, maybe parents didn't choose to change their students at the higher grade levels. There may be fewer options for high school, or parents are happier with high schools in their community than they were with the elementary schools. It could be any variety of reasons, and I don't have any data on that. I just know that the highest percentage are these younger children who are in elementary school. So well more than half of the students are in elementary school who have been getting, or who are current recipients of vouchers. All right, we'll move on. A little more about the demographics. This is racial demographics on the left and ethnic demographics on the right. About 3 or 4 years ago, the SEAA started surveying the recipients in a different way. Instead of asking the question all at once about your race and ethnicity, they divided the question into two. So people answer the question, are you Hispanic or not Hispanic? That's one question. And then the other question is identify your race. And the categories you see up there are the choices now: white, Black, African American, 2 or more races, Asian, Native American, are the ones that they offer to the recipients to choose from. So at the beginning of the program, African American students were enrolling at higher rates than their population in schools. So they were overrepresented in the voucher population, and whites were a little underrepresented. That has changed over time, and now the numbers are reasonably close to the numbers in the population. And so the program does seem to appeal to students in all racial and ethnic categories, and reasonably close to their overall population. So we don't have significant disproportionality in terms of who is participating in the voucher program from an ethnic and racial point of view. So one thing to note here also, though, is that public schools are not required to share their data regarding their enrollments. And so we don't have any good data on whether the schools that the voucher recipients are attending are segregated by race. We can observe that many private schools are relatively segregated by race, and there's no reason to think that the private schools that take voucher students are any more or less segregated than the whole group of private schools. But because the private schools don't have to share their enrollment data, they have to only report how many students attend. That's the only thing they have to report to the state. They do not have to report the race breakdown or the ethnic breakdown. So we really don't know within the private schools that are selected by families that are receiving the voucher, we don't know what the racial data are. So my office did, when I worked at Duke, we did some previous research on the racial composition of private schools, just in general. This was actually before the voucher program started, or it was right at the beginning of the voucher program. And we did some surveying, phone surveying, using whatever public data we could find, and determined that most of the private schools were somewhat racially segregated, meaning more than half of them had more than 80% of one race or another. So that was our definition for racially identifiable, that if more than 80% of the students were of one race. And most private schools in North Carolina fell into that category. Definitely not all, but most of them did. So we can make some assumptions, but I don't really have any strong data right now about the enrollments of the voucher students in the private schools and about segregation. All right, we'll move on. And this slide is just to show you that there are some, well, it shows you the schools with the highest funding. There are about 750 private schools in North Carolina, and 480 of them have at least one voucher recipient in this current school year. There are some that have very large enrollments of voucher students, and I've got the list right there, and you can see that Trinity Christian School in Fayetteville gets almost $1.5 million in revenue from voucher payments. Berean Baptist Academy, also in Fayetteville, gets nearly $1 million in voucher payments. And going down, you know, 700,000, 638,000, 629,000. So that's, you know, fairly substantial revenue for those schools. You can also see that the top schools are Christian schools. There are certainly other religious schools that are not just Christian schools. There are some Islamic schools, there are a couple of Jewish schools, but the primary religious schools that are receiving vouchers are the Christian schools. Some of the schools are pretty aggressive in their recruiting about letting parents know about the voucher program, and they help parents apply for the vouchers, and the school is pretty involved in making sure that every student at their school who's eligible for the voucher is getting the voucher. And so another thing to note here is you see that the two top schools are in Fayetteville, and then there's one in Richland and Jacksonville. So Fayetteville is the home of Fort Bragg, as you know, and Richland's and the Living Water School in Jacksonville are close to Camp Lejeune. So you may remember I said that students that have a parent on active military duty can apply for a voucher for the first time without having attended a public school. So that exception may say something about why these particular schools in Fayetteville and then the ones near Camp Lejeune and Jacksonville and Richlands have somewhat higher enrollments, being at the very top of the list of enrollments. When you look at the list of 480 schools, you know, there are, it just follows a curve with some of them like these with multiple hundreds of students getting vouchers, and then there are lots of schools where maybe there's, you know, 10 or 15 or 5 or 20. So there are a lot of schools that don't have huge numbers of voucher students in them, but just have, you know, a few or half a dozen or a dozen. But then there are these schools that are getting a lot of revenue from the vouchers. Okay, One other thing before I mention, I don't have this on a slide, but I just wanted to say also in terms of size that the range of schools, the range of size of the schools that participate are everything from 10 students up to over 1,000 students. The most common size is between 100 and 250 students. And the secular schools that participate tend to have a smaller number of voucher payments. I also did want to mention that, of course, the schools can also subsidize students. So they can take the voucher and then they can discount their own tuition to make it possible for students to attend. So they might, for example, have a tuition of $5,000, and for certain students, they say, we're going to write off the $800 difference and we'll take your voucher as full payment. And that can increase the number of students that can attend some of these private schools, if the private schools will subsidize the remaining tuition or provide their own scholarships for that difference between the voucher and their tuition in general. Okay, we can move on. So, as I said, the vouchers go to private schools in North Carolina. Private schools in North Carolina are relatively unregulated. So we have some of the, well, if you want to call it weakest regulation of private schools in the country, meaning that the state doesn't really tell them what to do. So here are the requirements for schools that are private schools and participate in the program. First thing they have to do is they have to do everything that any private school would have to do. For example, keep attendance and immunization records. Now, private schools pretty much have to do that. They have to have certain health and safety requirements met, and they have to register with the state. And they don't have to do a whole lot more. They do have to administer a nationally standardized test to students in 3rd, 6th, and 9th grade, and 3rd, 6th, 9th, and 11th, excuse me, grades. That's what just private schools who aren't taking any voucher money have to do. And one more, they have to be in session at least 9 months of the year. That's pretty much it. There are a few additional requirements for the schools that are in the voucher program. So they have to report the amount of tuition and fees to the SEAA. They have to administer tests annually to students in grade 3 through 12. So that's more than typical private schools have to do. They do have to conduct a background check on the top staff person. They have to report graduation rates to the state. And if they receive more than $300,000 in voucher money each year, they have to get a CPA to do a financial review. And if the state wants to see it, they have to make it available. And they have to not discriminate on the basis of race, color, or national origin. So that's what private schools have to do if they want to be in the voucher program and receive vouchers on behalf of the students that are enrolled there. All right, let's move on and look at what they don't have to do. So there's a lot that they don't have to do that you might have thought they would have to do. For example, there's no curriculum requirement. They don't have to meet any kind of state standard. They don't have to have any type of accreditation. They don't have to have certification for their teachers. They don't have to offer special education. They don't have to publish any data like the public schools do on the achievement. They don't have to provide a hearing for a student who is being expelled for disciplinary reasons. They don't have to do background checks on their staff. And they don't have to refrain from discrimination based on religion, disability, sexual orientation, or any other categories. So they are pretty much free to run the school the way they think it's appropriate to run the school. And if parents want to enroll, then they can enroll. All right, let's look at the next slide, which is a little bit of a comparison between some of the other similar voucher programs in the country. Around the country, there are about, I count about 14 programs that are similar in character and quality, and quality isn't the right word, in legal characteristics to our program, in that it's a statewide program. It provides a voucher payment in a similar way that North Carolina does, and has financial eligibility. There are several cities that also have these programs. In fact, Milwaukee and Cleveland were among the first voucher programs in the country. So they were just essentially citywide, and they started in the 90s. And then these states that are listed on the chart there came after that. What this shows is all those checks are for each of the states or the cities, and what their requirements are for their private schools who take voucher payments. So the top line is how many have to have either some kind of accreditation or approval to operate their school from the state. That's all the states and cities except for North Carolina and Arizona. The next line is about the curriculum. Do they regulate the curriculum? So everybody regulates the curriculum except for North Carolina. Certified teachers, except for Arizona and North Carolina. All the states require certified teachers. Participation in the state testing program is a little bit less, but you see that 7 of them require participation in the state testing program completely. There's a couple that have some caveats. I've got the little notes there. I won't go over them now, again, except for Arizona and North Carolina. And then the regulation of hours and days of school, everybody does that except for North Carolina. We just say, run your school for 9 months. You can have a 3-hour day if you want, as long as you're in session for 9 months. So you can see that we had choices. And if we were like most of the voucher programs, we would have had more requirements for the private schools that are participating, but that was a choice the General Assembly made, not to regulate the private schools in ways that other jurisdictions have done so. All right, let us move on to the next one, which is a question that a lot of people ask. Well, how do they do? Because one of the reasons that people believe that vouchers are good public policy is they say that if this student is not being well served, not being well educated in a public school, they should have the opportunity to choose a, quote, better private school so that their educational opportunities are increased and their educational achievement improves. Well, turns out we don't really know. We certainly don't know in North Carolina. The law says that schools are required to report aggregate data on those test results. I told you they had to administer a nationally standardized test to students in all grades 3 through 12. Aggregate test results are test results that are not disaggregated or not segregated out by any characteristic, not by grade level, not by sex, not by socioeconomic, not by subject matter, nothing, just aggregate test data. And then with that aggregate test data, the SEAA was supposed to report on learning gains and losses of the voucher recipients. The SEAA attempted to follow the law at the beginning, but concluded that this aggregate data was completely meaningless and was quite confusing. And so they don't even ask the schools to report it. And they just don't report on learning gains and losses because, as the director told me when we talked about it on the phone, there's no valid data. There is nothing that they can get their hands on from the schools that would allow them to make any kind of statistically valid report on learning gains and losses. And so this part of the law is just not being enforced. And the SEA has gone to the legislature and asked them to do something about it, but they haven't. All right, let's move on. I know we are running short of time, and I want to be sure to have some time for questions and answers, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. With some private money, a research group at NC State did do a study of the program, and it issued a variety of reports on the program. They did do their own attempt at looking at the academic gains and losses with a very small group of volunteers from both public and private schools who took the same test so they could match test, apples to apples. And they came up with some conclusions, but one of the main conclusions they came up with, which I'm quoted there in the red, the biggest takeaway from this paper is just how many limitations there are to conducting a high quality evaluation of the program's academic impact given the current statutes. So again, we really just don't know much about the academic outcomes. Nationally, there have been a number of studies. The early studies were kind of mixed, but the most recent studies of statewide programs have shown that, and I think the Indiana one is kind of summarizes everything, even though it was said in the Indiana study. No consistent evidence, there is no consistent evidence that voucher programs promote increased academic achievement among low-income recipients. And in Louisiana, the students actually fell behind when they went to their private schools with their vouchers, and as they did in Ohio. So the national data, as I said before, about 2016 or 17 was kind of mixed, but the most recent data is not showing any academic advantage for students on vouchers. All right. One other study I wanted to share with you quickly is that the League of Women Voters of the Lower Cape Fear studied the curricula used at schools receiving vouchers, and they found that more than 75% of those schools are using a Bible-based curriculum. When they asked a group of university professors to review that curriculum, the university professors in any event found that the curriculum was not consistent with the North Carolina standards and contradicted those standards in some aspects. They said there were some areas where science and religion were confused, and at least in the opinion of these professors who reviewed it, these curricula were not preparing students for college level courses, nor were they really preparing them for the kind of skills they would need in 21st century jobs. So that, of course, is allowed by our program to choose any kind of curriculum that the school wants to offer. Okay, just briefly, I'm sure most of you kind of know the arguments for and against voucher programs, but I just thought I'd quickly go over those, and we may talk a little bit more about this in the question and answer. But why do people like voucher programs? They like it because they like the choice. In particular, our program gives parents who want religious education for their children public support to enroll their children in religious schools. And it has done that pretty successfully. The parents for whom religious training is a very high priority have used the voucher program more than any other group of parents choosing religious education for their children. There is some argument that by having a voucher program, there will be a competitive effect so that public schools will need to compete harder for students to enroll, and that will make everybody better. So the private schools will have to compete for students, and the public schools have to compete for students, and that there will be a positive competitive effect. That has right now, not much research to support that, but it's an argument that's made that some people think has some intuitive credibility to it. And there is also an argument that as children are removed from the public school, the cost to the public of educating them is reduced because the voucher is less than the per pupil cost. That also is somewhat questionable, and we could potentially come back to that. Just then summarizing the arguments against vouchers, which is on the next slide. One is simply, these are public dollars and we have public schools that are insufficiently funded, and we should use every possible dollar for our public schools, is a view that many people subscribe to. Another is that there is just insufficient accountability for the funding. So we may be throwing away our money on these private schools and we don't even know it because there's not much accountability. As I said, the overall evidence is that vouchers do not improve academic performance of the students that are in the private schools. There is concern that without the standards that are imposed by the state, some of the students might be being insufficiently educated to move on to post-secondary school and jobs. And in general, the public should not be supporting schools that discriminate. So there are more arguments against vouchers. There are more for them. Those are some of the ones that I'm just holding up for you to think about. So recommendations for improvement, as long as we're going to have a voucher program, in my view, requiring something more of the curriculum, to me, is at the top of the list. I think that if schools, like in other states, had to meet certain academic standards, that would be to the benefit of the students who are in the program. Teacher certification for at least a portion of the teachers could improve the accountability and confidence in those schools. Certain testing requirements so that we would know more would, I think, improve the program, and a way to figure out how to do testing so we have some apples to apples comparisons to make. I certainly think that schools should be prohibited from discriminating on all grounds, not just race, color, and increased financial oversight might also benefit all of us. There was a school that had 150 students and it crashed in the middle of the year, and those 150 students had to be absorbed in the local schools around them, like with no notice. So better financial oversight might have prevented that. All right, I'm going to stop here and give Matt a chance to make some observations or ask some questions. I'm not hearing you, Matt.
Thank you.
There
The
we go.
organizer had muted me. I'm going to throw you under the bus, the organizer. But yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm a huge fan of Public Schools First. I've been since its inception. Appreciate the work that y'all do. And this is a lot like my regular life, getting to ask Jane questions about things that I want to understand better, even in retirement, bothering her. So I'm glad to be doing it here at this event. Thanks for having me. So I thought one of the most striking kind of set of slides that you had was one, comparing North Carolina to other voucher states on the various programmatic requirements, because those are states that are obviously friendly to the concept of vouchers. That's why they have a voucher program. It's amazing how different it is. I think the argument we get, and for folks who want to advocate at the legislature when we go down to try to improve those accountability measures, tends to be that the element of parental choice provides all the accountability that's needed. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I would say first of all that I think parental accountability has a place. It's not that it's not a part of it. In my view, it's not, the real question is how much a part of it, and how much is left for sort of society and to be accountable to society. And I think the way I think of it is, you know, how do we think about educating our children? Is this just a private commodity that's just for parents and just for parents to make decisions about their own children? If so, well, okay, maybe parental accountability is all that we need. But I don't see it that way. I think the education of our children is something that we all care about. We all should care about. It's a societal obligation to make sure that our children writ large are well educated and grow up and are able to take their part in society. And so I think we need, as we think of it, not as a private commodity, but as a public good. And when you have a public good, you have to have some accountability to the public. So I think generally that's kind of the way I think about it. And, you know, as I said, some parents have the first priority as the religious training of their children, and they don't really care so much about
I think you went out, Jane.
Yeah.
Hey, Jane, we can't hear you.
We lost Jane somehow. Maybe she can't hear us either.
other schools accountable to that. So just some of my thoughts there.
Thanks. We lost you for a little bit, but we caught, I think, some of the good stuff at the beginning. Thank you. I think another common argument that I've encountered amongst legislators is kind of what you referred to, that because the size of the voucher is smaller than the amount of per pupil expenditure in public schools, that it saves the state money. Did you see any evidence that there's some noticeable amount of savings that have materialized for the state, or is the opposite true, since you did have the graph showing the amount of money that's going out the door to private schools is over
Right.
220 million. So what do you think about
Yeah,
that?
you know, I'm not really a budget and tax person, so I don't really have the details, but I would say that the per pupil expenditure for public schools includes a lot of fixed costs, and those are not saved when a student goes off and takes a voucher and goes to private school. The other thing is that we're now kind of allowing a lot of the voucher students to get vouchers, but they would have gone to private school anyway. And so if they would have gone to private school anyway, we hadn't really accounted for them in our big school budget. And so then sending the voucher out is just a total net loss. So I don't know all the particulars, but I don't think it's probably true that we're saving a lot of money by this. And, you know, that money, one could argue, could be better spent on students who would always be in the public schools.
And it seems like from your presentation, we're moving in the direction of expanding who's eligible and probably capturing more of those people who would have already gone to private school, like you said.
It seems that way, yeah.
That's the way it seems to be. Generally, that's what people said when the program started, and it's consistently seems to have moved in that direction to meet that lack of demand that you highlighted. So what kind of student achievement measures would you recommend? How would you go about, you know, you mentioned we have no idea what's going on with the academic performance of voucher recipients. So how do we begin to put the pieces of that puzzle back together so we do have some idea?
Yeah, I mean, it is tricky. I mean, because you want something that's fair, and you want something that actually does measure academic achievement, and you want something that allows you a good comparison. And if you don't have the same curricular requirements, it's kind of not fair to give the kids the same test. So I think it needs to be paired with curricular requirements. If we said, okay, private schools, here are the at least basic standards you need to be teaching at each grade level, and that's what the state end of grade tests are testing on, then it would be more fair, it seems, to ask the private school students to take the very same test that the public school students are taking, as long as it's tied to the curricular standards, so we can feel confident that it's actually measuring what they're being taught in the classroom. And then we would be able to compare, and we'd have a better measure. So I think the puzzle has to have a part of curricular standards matched up with similar testing to make it work.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the biggest concern a lot of advocates have around the voucher program is that you referenced, is that we have problems in our funding for our public education system generally. And it's really kind of been highlighted to an extreme degree in the Leandro proceedings and the West Ed report that was done as part of that, where they had the experts come in and look at our system and show the extent of the underfunding of our public system. So is there anything that can be put into place now that the program's here, assuming that it can't be done away with? What can be done to ensure that we're limiting the damage in terms of how much funding is getting siphoned off from public education into the private schools through this program?
Uh-oh.
I mean, it really is so totally up to the General Assembly, and of course they're responsive to all of us. But right now, this General Assembly is very bullish on it. It seems to me certainly to have a limit that we're not going to spend more money on vouchers until we get some evidence that they're doing the things that we said they were going to do. And as I pointed out, there is more money appropriated than is currently being spent. Well, let's limit that and say that we're not going to spend more money, we're not going to increase eligibility until we have better evidence that it's accomplishing some goal that's good public policy. And I don't know that this legislature has that in mind, but that would seem to me at least a starting place.
I think another concern we have where we just don't, the lack of information is really the problem, or we don't have any idea of what this is doing in terms of increasing segregation. Is there anything that we can do, you think, to help be able to measure that or ensure that the program isn't leading to increased segregation in our districts?
Well, we certainly could require more reporting. Right now we don't make them tell us whether they're segregated or not. So just getting some data would help. I had this sort of wild idea that maybe the voucher amount could be lessened or increased. So in other words, there could be 2 tiers, and schools that met certain requirements or certain numbers on their diversity, they'd get a higher voucher, and the ones that were segregated would get a lower voucher. That might encourage schools to try to recruit a more diverse group. But I think at least reporting, getting some data would at least start moving us in the right direction there.
That's great. Thank you so much. That's all I had for questions. I don't know if Yvonne had additional questions that you wanted to ask.
I do want to say that one of the questions that we're getting a lot, Jane, is people are very concerned about that the majority of the schools, it goes from 75 to 80%, depending on the year, are religious schools. This is something that really sticks as a sticking point for a lot of people. And I don't know that there's any answer. There's no question here. It's more of a comment, Jane. There are still many people who believe that it is against the Constitution that, that we should have separation of church and state, that we're allowing these vouchers. Now, I don't want to put you and Matt on the spot, but you both are attorneys. Do you have a personal view of the constitutionality of, in your view, of this concept of religious schools being funded by public dollars?
Well, for starters, I don't get to interpret the Constitution. The Supreme Court gets to interpret the Constitution, and the Supreme Court interpreted the Constitution and said these voucher programs are not a violation of the principle of separation of church and state. So that's just the way it is. And the Supreme Court said, you know, the money is not technically going to the schools, it's going to the parents, and the parents are the ones who are making the decisions, and parents have the choice to use it at a religious school or a non-religious school. It's not the state that's making that choice for it to go to a religious school, so it doesn't violate the principle of the state not, you know, the state is not allowed to, you know, establish religion. We also lost a challenge against the program in the North Carolina Supreme Court. So regardless of how Matt or I might like to interpret the Constitution, it has been interpreted for us both at the state and federal level as being a constitutional choice that the legislature has made.
And I think that's a very valid point to make, and I wanted to explain that to our viewers tonight, because it's the question that comes up, Matt, every time we have this on our agenda, every program we present. How can they get away with doing this? I always think that we need to explain it, although it's kind of hard to take sometimes. Another thing, Jane and Matt, maybe you can talk about is that currently there is a bill before the Senate and the House, and I think it might be merged in with the budget bill this year to actually increase the amount of money, right? To increase it from like $4,200 to $5,900 for a voucher. Matt, have you seen any progress on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very good chance it could end up in the final version of the budget. I think it's a really important thing for advocates to work on. That budget is sort of taking place in a way that we don't get to see it. Supposedly there are negotiations happening between the House and the Senate and the governor, as well as some of the Democratic conferees who voted for the budget, and Republican conferees as well. It's a really important time to be weighing in on that issue, though. If you feel that this program's problematic and that's inappropriate to be making it larger and expanding it to people who are more and more affluent, and making, and just draining more of the limited funding that's available, it's something you need to be weighing in on right now. It's happening right now. So it's going to be it's hard to get rid of these things once they're there. And it's very likely that could happen unless there's a strong outpouring from people across the state on that particular issue.
Well, and so one of the things that Matt just said, I think, is talking about raising the level too, because Jane, you reported it being for a family of 4, the qualifying income to be equal or no more than $73,500. And in the current budget bill, it's $85,000 for a family of 4. And someone told me that with families with children, that's about 72% of all the families in North Carolina with school-age children. Now, for all families, it's about $85,000, the median income for a family of 4. But when you take a look at children, school-age children, it grows to about 72%. So that's, Matt, to your point, it started off as a small program aimed at low-income families as a safety valve for them to have an alternative source of education. But when you're talking about 65, 70, 72%, depending on which demographic denominator you use, that's not a small group of underprivileged low-income families. This is the majority of families in North Carolina in our still very rural state would qualify for this voucher program. So that's really something of concern too, because it ties back to Jane's earlier point on the money being drained out of the public school system. Jane, I do want to say that I really like your suggestion about looking at ways to evaluate the programs and doing that by requiring some curriculum basis. I have looked at a few other states that at least require some of the standard course of studies, so to speak, to be present for, reading, math, and science. Not all the subjects, but that they adopt at least the reading, math, and science and use a standardized national norm-based test or a state reference test. And so I like your suggestion on that, because we clearly can't measure apples and oranges and be fair. And I like that you included that word fair. because we're not looking to unfairly evaluate the private schools. Of course not. And so I really like your tying those two things together. I hadn't heard that suggestion. And then my last comment to Jane is that I do also, why not, Matt? Why don't we try to say that there's some bonus money for doing better things for kids? You know, some bonus money if you don't segregate, or some bonus money if you adopt certified teachers, or some bonus money if you will be willing to adopt the standard course of study, at least in your core areas. So I don't know, Jane, I'm going to steal that suggestion from you and use it when I'm talking about maybe we're in a rock and a hard place. If we don't think the voucher program is working effectively for children, and we at this time have no way to put a moratorium on this program, why don't we go back to looking for ways to improve the program, which, Jane, you have an excellent suggestions here. And then I am okay with incentivizing, if that's what it takes, Matt, to get a better situation for children, more inclusive education for children. So these were excellent suggestions. Matt, I want to thank you and Jane very much for being here tonight. It's been a great program. It's very informative information. I do hope that folks will make sure that they tune in to this program and watch it, and then take some action, right? Because one of the most important things that we know is that being an educated voter is very important. If you care about public education as passionately as these three people on your screen right now, then you want to be informed, and you want to make sure that all tax dollars, all public funds are being spent effectively, and that the child is the benefactor of these funds in a way that, as Jane said at the very beginning, make sure that this child grows up with the education they need to be effective in the economy and to contribute to the world and society around them. So I hope that you've learned a lot from this program tonight, our viewers. I hope it's also made you question some things, and I hope you'll do what Matt said, which is really speak up right now about the budget that's before the General Assembly and the governor, to make sure that we get the funding we need, and it's targeted towards children who need it the most. Everybody, I'm going to say good night. Thank you again for coming. Jane, thank you so much. Matt, thank you so much. So good night, everybody. Thank you very much.